Rule number 1 of surviving the frontier, Daniel Carter liked to say to nobody in particular. If something small is hiding in your toolbox, it's probably smarter than you. The abandoned mining station groaned softly under the weight of the evening wind, long metal beams expanding and contracting with slow tired creaks as the desert air cooled across the red dust plains stretching for miles in every direction. Daniel wiped grease from his hands onto a faded work rag and leaned back under the open maintenance panel of his rover, the smell of warm circuitry and machine oil filling the quiet garage bay. Out here on the edge of mapped space, 200 miles from the nearest colony and about 1,000 miles from anything that could politely be called civilization, the only sounds most days were the hum of aging generators and the steady whistle of desert wind sliding through cracked solar arrays. Daniel preferred it that way. Machines were predictable. Machines made sense. People less so. He reached into a metal toolbox sitting beside the rover tire and fumbled for a half-inch wrench, his fingers brushing something soft instead of cold steel. He paused. Slowly he looked down. The toolbox lid was open just enough for the dim yellow shop light to spill inside, illuminating a shape that absolutely had not been there 10 minutes ago. 2 enormous violet eyes stared back at him. Daniel blinked once, then twice. The creature inside the box was tiny, no taller than 10 inches. Its smooth blue skin faintly luminous in the dusty light. Thin arms wrapped tightly around its knees as if trying to make itself even smaller. Wisps of silvery hair floated around its head like threads of starlight caught in low gravity. For a moment neither of them moved. Then the tiny alien girl suddenly gasped, scrambled backward against a pile of wrenches, and raised both hands in surrender. "Please don't eat me," she squeaked in perfect but trembling English. Daniel sat very still beneath the rover frame, staring at the miniature visitor like a man trying to decide whether he had finally worked too many 12-hour repair shifts in a row. "Well," he muttered slowly, "that's a new one." The girl squeezed her eyes shut, clearly expecting something terrible to happen. Instead, she heard the clank of a tool dropping on the concrete floor. Daniel scooted out from under the rover and sat cross-legged beside the toolbox, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied her with open curiosity. Up close, she looked even smaller than he thought, delicate but alert, like a hummingbird that had accidentally flown into the wrong universe. Her eyes cracked open cautiously. The towering human was not baring teeth or preparing cooking equipment like the stories warned. He was just looking at her, confused, a little amused. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Kid," he said gently, "I don't even eat the vegetables I buy at the store. I'm definitely not starting with a visitor." The tiny alien girl blinked again, clearly unsure how to process that answer, while the wind outside swept across the empty mining fields and the old station lights flickered softly over the most unexpected first contact either of them could have imagined. Daniel Carter had met a lot of strange things in the outer systems during 12 years of salvage work, but a 10-inch tall alien hiding in his toolbox was definitely climbing toward the top of the list. The little blue girl slowly opened one eye, then the other, clearly expecting at any moment for the giant human in front of her to reveal sharp teeth or some kind of cooking pot. Instead, Daniel simply reached over, grabbed a dented metal stool, and sat down beside the rover like a mechanic taking a break between jobs. The quiet humming of the station generators filled the garage bay while warm yellow light reflected across old tool cabinets and dusty concrete floors. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel leaned forward slightly and pointed at himself. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said calmly. "Most people around here just call me Dan." The tiny alien girl stared at him as if he had just broken several important rules of the universe. According to everything she had ever been taught, humans did not introduce themselves before eating something. She slowly lowered her raised hands, but remained ready to jump at any sudden movement. Her voice came out small but steady. "My name is Lyra." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Lyra, that is a good name." Then he glanced down into the toolbox again, clearly studying the cramped pile of screwdrivers and wrenches she had chosen as her hiding place. "You must have been uncomfortable sitting in there." Lyra blinked in confusion. Discomfort had not been her main concern. Survival had been. She carefully leaned forward and peered over the edge of the toolbox. The human towered over her like a walking mountain, easily 6 feet tall, broad shoulders wrapped in a faded work jacket that smelled faintly of dust and engine oil. Everything about him suggested power and size, yet he was speaking in the same relaxed tone someone might use when greeting a neighbor. That did not match the stories at all. Daniel reached into a nearby supply crate and pulled out a small foil packet. Lyra immediately tensed again as he opened it with a soft tearing sound. The smell of chocolate and peanut butter drifted into the air. Daniel broke the cookie in half and placed one piece on the edge of the toolbox near her tiny feet before taking a bite of the other half himself. Lyra watched closely, her violet eyes wide. The human was eating the same food he offered her. That was not the behavior of a predator preparing a meal. Daniel chewed slowly, clearly giving her time to decide. After several seconds, Lyra stepped forward cautiously and lifted the crumb-sized piece with both hands. She sniffed it first, then took the smallest possible bite. Her eyes widened instantly. Daniel chuckled quietly. Good, right? Lyra nodded before she could stop herself, then froze again as if she had accidentally broken some kind of diplomatic protocol. The human simply leaned back on his stool and gestured toward the vast, empty garage around them. You picked a strange place to land, he said. The nearest town is about 200 miles east, and nothing out here moves unless I fix it first. Lyra slowly sat down on the edge of the toolbox, clutching the cookie piece while her mind struggled to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed. The ancient warnings about humans described unstoppable hunters, creatures that consumed entire worlds without hesitation. Yet the giant mechanic in front of her was offering snacks and introducing himself like a polite neighbor. For the first time since she had crashed on the desert planet, Lyra began to wonder if the stories about humans had been wrong. The wind outside the mining station carried long streams of red dust across the cracked landing pad, while the old facility. Lights hummed quietly above Daniel Carter and his unexpected visitor. Lyra sat on the edge of the metal toolbox with both hands wrapped around the last crumbs of the cookie, studying the human in front of her with cautious curiosity. Daniel seemed completely comfortable with the situation, which somehow made the moment even stranger. He stood up slowly and walked over to the rover again, picking up the wrench he had dropped earlier and tightening a loose bolt beneath the engine housing. The metal tool clicked rhythmically while the generator hummed in the background. Lyra watched every movement. The stories about humans always described them as restless hunters, creatures that constantly searched for prey or territory. Yet this one appeared focused on something entirely different. Machines. Broken machines. After a minute, Daniel slid back out from under the rover and wiped his hands on the rag again. When he looked toward the toolbox, he noticed that Lyra had climbed up onto a small screwdriver handle so she could see better over the edge. That made him smile slightly. You are curious, he said in a calm voice. That is usually a good sign. Lyra tilted her head, still observing him carefully. Why are you repairing that vehicle? She asked quietly. Daniel glanced back toward the rover. Because it stopped working this morning. Out here, if something breaks, you fix it, or you walk 200 miles through the desert. Lyra tried to imagine walking 200 miles across the empty red plain she had seen from the sky earlier. Even the thought made her shiver. Daniel walked over to a workbench and pulled out a small square device that looked like a miniature tablet screen. He placed it gently on the floor beside the toolbox and tapped the side. A soft blue light filled the screen as it activated. Lyra leaned forward slightly. What is that? Navigation display, Daniel explained. He pointed at a glowing dot in the center of the map. That is us. Everything else around it is empty desert. Lyra studied the map in silence. For someone her size, the entire station already felt enormous. Seeing the endless miles of empty land around them made it feel even larger. You live here alone? She asked slowly. Daniel nodded. Most of the year, yes. Salvage crews pass through sometimes, but mostly it is just me and a lot of old equipment. Lyra looked around the garage again, noticing the shelves filled with tools, spare circuits, and mechanical parts sorted into careful rows. The place was worn but organized, like someone had built a quiet routine here over many years. Daniel opened a small metal container and pulled out a bottle of water. He poured a little into the lid and slid it closer to the toolbox so Lyra could reach it easily. She hesitated for a moment before carefully climbing down and taking a drink. The water tasted clean and cool after the long hours she had spent hiding inside the station. When she finished, she looked up at the human again, clearly puzzled. Daniel noticed the expression and leaned against the workbench. "Something on your mind," he said. Lyra held the bottle lid with both hands and spoke the question that had been circling in her thoughts since she first saw him. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel shrugged slightly, as if the answer were obvious. "Because you needed help." Lyra blinked, waiting for him to add something more complicated, but he did not. The explanation ended there. For a moment, the only sound in the station was the distant whistle of wind moving across the empty desert. Lyra slowly looked down at the small pool of water in the lid she was holding, and then back up at the enormous human who had offered it to her without hesitation. According to every story she had ever heard, humans were supposed to be the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. Yet the only thing Daniel Carter seemed interested in hunting was a loose bolt inside a broken rover engine. The desert wind outside the mining station grew stronger as evening settled across the red plains, pushing thin clouds of dust against the tall metal walls with a soft scraping sound that echoed faintly through the garage. Inside, the yellow workshop lights hummed steadily while Daniel Carter tightened the final bolt on the rover engine and lowered the maintenance panel with a solid metallic click. Lyra watched from the edge of the toolbox, her violet eyes following every motion with careful attention. The human moved with calm efficiency, never rushing, never acting like the terrifying predators described in the ancient records of her people. When Daniel finished, he stepped back and wiped his hands again before reaching over to tap a small switch on the wall. The rover responded with a quiet electronic chirp as its systems came online. Lyra flinched at the sudden sound, but quickly realized nothing dangerous had happened. Daniel noticed her reaction and gave a small, reassuring wave of his hand. "Just a system check," he explained casually. "Machines like to complain if you ignore them too long." The rover engine began to hum softly, its internal systems warming up after the repair. Lyra climbed a little higher on the toolbox edge so she could see the vehicle better. To her, it looked enormous, like a moving building made of metal and lights. Daniel leaned against the rover tire and watched the diagnostic panel on the dashboard. Numbers scrolled across the display while the engine tested its power systems. Everything seemed stable. After a moment, he nodded with quiet satisfaction. "That should hold for another few thousand miles," he said. Lyra hesitated before speaking again. "You repair machines the same way you helped me?" she observed carefully. Daniel looked down at her with mild curiosity. "What do you mean?" Lyra gestured toward the rover. "When something is damaged, you fix it. You do not discard it." Daniel considered that for a moment. "I guess that is true," he admitted. "It takes less time to repair something than to start over with a new one." Lyra slowly absorbed that answer. On her home world, efficiency was valued above nearly everything else. Broken tools were replaced immediately, not repaired. Broken things were considered wasteful. Yet this human seemed to treat damaged objects with patience and attention, as if restoring them mattered. Daniel walked over to the workbench and grabbed a small portable lamp, then set it on the floor near the toolbox so Lyra would have more light. The soft glow illuminated her delicate features and the faint shimmer of her blue skin. She looked around the garage again, noticing details she had missed earlier. Every shelf held organized rows of parts, each one cleaned and labeled carefully. Even pieces that looked old or worn had been stored instead of thrown away. Daniel followed her gaze and chuckled quietly. "A lot of that equipment came from ships that people gave up on," he explained. "I just give the parts another chance to work somewhere else." Lyra sat quietly for several seconds, thinking about that idea. Another chance. The phrase felt unfamiliar but comforting at the same time. Outside, the wind continued to sweep across the endless desert while the mining station lights glowed steadily in the darkness. Inside the garage, the enormous human mechanic leaned back against the rover and took a sip from his water bottle, completely unaware that the tiny visitor sitting in his toolbox was slowly rewriting everything she had ever believed about his species. The station grew quieter as night settled across the desert, the wide sky outside turning a deep shade of violet beyond the dusty windows, while the wind softened into a slow, steady whisper against the metal walls. Inside the garage bay, the repaired rover idled briefly before Daniel Carter switched it off, satisfied that the engine diagnostics showed everything running smoothly again. The sudden silence that followed made the small sounds of the station more noticeable, the gentle hum of power converters, the faint ticking of cooling metal, and the occasional creak of the tall structure adjusting to the cooler night air. Lyra remained seated on the edge of the toolbox beneath the warm glow of the portable lamp Daniel had placed nearby, her small hands resting on the metal surface as she continued observing the enormous human mechanic moving around the garage. Daniel walked toward a storage cabinet and opened it, pulling out a simple metal lunch container before setting it on the workbench. When he opened the lid, the smell of warm bread and roasted vegetables filled the air. Lyra watched carefully as he sat down on the stool beside the workbench and began eating slowly, taking quiet bites while studying a tablet screen that displayed maintenance logs for the station equipment. The routine looked peaceful and ordinary, which only made it stranger to Lyra. According to the historical archives of her people, humans were creatures of relentless expansion and unstoppable appetite, beings that consumed resources without pause. Yet the human in front of her seemed perfectly content sitting in a dusty garage on an empty planet, eating a simple dinner and repairing old machines. Daniel noticed her watching again and glanced over with a relaxed smile. "You can come closer if you want," he said. "I promise the floor is safe." Lyra hesitated for a moment before carefully climbing down from the toolbox, using a screwdriver handle as a step before reaching the concrete floor. From that level the garage felt even larger, every tool cabinet rising above her like a tall building. She walked slowly toward the workbench until she reached the base of the stool where Daniel sat. He looked down at her and gently pushed a tiny piece of bread from his container toward the edge of the bench so it fell within her reach. Lyra picked it up with both hands and tasted it cautiously. The flavor was warm and comforting, nothing like the harsh survival rations she had eaten during her escape. Daniel leaned back slightly, resting his arms on the bench while finishing his meal. After a moment, he asked a question that carried simple curiosity rather than suspicion. "So what brought you all the way out here, Lyra? That is a long way from anywhere important." Lyra looked down at the piece of bread she was holding, clearly considering how much to reveal. "My ship experienced a navigation failure," she answered quietly. "I escaped before the landing sequence completed." Daniel nodded slowly, as if that explanation made perfect sense. "Space can be rough on small craft," he said, "especially around these desert storms." Lyra glanced toward the large station door where the distant wind continued sweeping across the empty plains. For the first time since her arrival on the planet, she did not feel completely alone. The massive human above her finished his meal and closed the container before standing up and stretching his arms slightly after the long repair work. He looked down again at the tiny blue visitor standing beside the workbench and gave a thoughtful nod. "Well, Lyra," he said in the same calm tone he had used all evening, "looks like you landed in the right garage after all." The night outside the mining station stretched wide and silent across the desert, the sky filled with unfamiliar stars that shimmered through thin ribbons of drifting dust, while the station lights cast long golden reflections across the concrete floor of the garage. Daniel Carter finished securing the last food container and placed it back inside the storage cabinet before turning toward the large observation window at the far end of the room. Beyond the glass, the red plains rolled endlessly toward the horizon, illuminated only by the faint glow of distant moons. Lyra stood quietly beside the workbench where she had finished the small piece of bread, her attention shifting between the enormous human and the quiet landscape beyond the station walls. Daniel walked across the garage and tapped a control panel near the window. A soft mechanical hum followed as the outer floodlights powered on, casting wide beams of white light across the landing pad and revealing long trails of wind-shaped dust drifting slowly through the night air. Lyra stepped closer to the window, climbing carefully onto the lower metal frame so she could see outside more clearly. From her height, the world beyond the glass looked impossibly vast, an endless wilderness of stone and sand that stretched farther than her eyes could follow. Daniel leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the panel and folded his arms loosely while studying the quiet desert. "Storms should pass by morning," he said calmly. "These winds usually calm down after midnight." Lyra turned toward him, curiosity bright in her violet eyes. "You understand the weather patterns here?" Daniel nodded. "When you live on a planet long enough, you learn how it breathes." Lyra considered that phrase for a moment. Her people had always studied planets from orbit, analyzing climates through data and observation satellites. They rarely experienced the surface of a world directly. Yet this human spoke about the planet almost like it was something alive, something familiar. Daniel pushed away from the wall and walked toward a small equipment rack near the garage entrance. He pulled down a folded cloth from the shelf and returned to the workbench where Lyra had been sitting earlier. With careful movements, he arranged the cloth beside the portable lamp, creating a soft space on the metal surface. Lyra watched with quiet confusion. Daniel noticed the look and shrugged slightly. "Thought you might want somewhere more comfortable than a toolbox tonight," he said simply. Lyra stepped onto the cloth and felt the difference immediately. The soft fabric was warmer than the cool metal beneath it. She looked up at Daniel again, her expression thoughtful. "Where will you sleep?" she asked. Daniel pointed toward a hallway leading deeper into the station. "Small living quarters down that corridor. Nothing fancy, but it works." Lyra looked once more toward the massive empty desert outside the window, and then back toward the quiet garage where the human mechanic had spent the evening repairing machines and sharing food with a stranger from another world. The ancient records of her civilization described humans as unstoppable forces of expansion, creatures that conquered planets and consumed everything in their path. Yet Daniel Carter had spent the entire night fixing broken equipment, studying weather patterns, and making sure a tiny visitor had somewhere comfortable to rest. As the wind outside softened into a slow whisper and the station lights dimmed slightly for the night cycle, Lyra settled onto the cloth beside the warm lamp and realized something that had never occurred to her before. Perhaps the most misunderstood creatures in the galaxy were not the ones who looked the most dangerous, but the ones no one had ever taken the time to truly understand. Morning arrived slowly across the desert as pale golden sunlight crept over the horizon and spilled across the red plains surrounding the old mining station. The wind that had whispered through the night was finally gone, leaving the air still and quiet outside the wide observation window. Inside the garage, the station lights dimmed automatically as the daylight sensors activated, allowing the natural glow of the rising sun to fill the space with a warm amber color. Daniel Carter stepped back into the garage carrying a steaming metal mug in one hand while stretching his shoulders after the short walk from his living quarters down the hallway. He paused when he noticed the small cloth bed near the workbench was empty. For a moment, he scanned the room before spotting Lyra standing on the window frame again, both small hands pressed against the glass as she stared out at the enormous desert beyond the station walls. Daniel walked over quietly and leaned beside the window, careful not to startle her. "First sunrise on this planet?" he asked in a calm voice. Lyra nodded slowly without taking her eyes off the horizon. The sun was climbing above distant rock formations, painting the desert in layers of red, copper, and gold that stretched farther than she could see. "I have never been on the surface of a world like this before," she said softly. Daniel lifted the mug to take a sip of coffee before answering. "Planets look different when you stand on them instead of flying over them. You notice things orbiting sensors miss." Lyra turned toward him with curiosity. "What things?" Daniel gestured toward the wide horizon. "Wind patterns, temperature changes, how the ground shifts during the day. You start to see how everything works together." Lyra studied his expression. The human spoke about the desert with quiet respect, almost like someone describing an old friend. Daniel set the mug down on the window ledge and pulled a small handheld scanner from his pocket. He tapped the screen a few times before pointing it toward the open sky outside. The device emitted a soft tone as it analyzed the atmosphere. "Air pressure is steady," he said. "No storms for at least 12 hours. That means I can take the rover out later and check the old supply towers to the north." Lyra tilted her head. "You travel across the desert alone." Daniel shrugged. "Someone has to keep the old infrastructure working. Outposts like this used to support hundreds of mining crews before the corporations moved operations to other systems. Now it is mostly automated equipment and one stubborn mechanic who refuses to let the place fall apart." Lyra watched him closely. "Why stay here if everyone else left?" Daniel picked up his mug again and looked out across the empty plains. "Because things still need someone who cares enough to keep them running," he said simply. Lyra considered those words carefully. In her world, usefulness was measured by efficiency and scale. Entire planetary networks were maintained by automated systems that replaced damaged equipment instantly. Yet here on this quiet desert planet, a single human spent his days repairing machines that no one else seemed to notice anymore. Daniel finished his coffee and turned away from the window, walking toward the garage doors where the rover waited quietly after yesterday's repairs. Lyra remained on the window frame for a moment longer, watching the sunlight spread across the endless landscape before following him across the garage. As she climbed onto the edge of the workbench again, she realized something that would have sounded impossible only one day earlier. The giant human mechanic she had once feared was not the most dangerous creature in the galaxy. He might actually be one of the most patient. The desert morning grew brighter as the sun climbed higher above the distant rock formations, filling the sky with pale gold light that stretched across the endless red plains surrounding the mining station. Inside the garage, the large metal doors slowly opened with a deep mechanical hum as Daniel Carter activated the control panel beside the entrance. Outside, the landing pad glowed under the fresh sunlight while long shadows from old communication towers stretched across the sand like silent watchtowers from a forgotten era. The rover stood ready just beyond the doorway, its engine systems already warmed from the earlier diagnostics. Lyra sat on the edge of the workbench watching Daniel prepare for the day's work, her violet eyes following each movement with growing curiosity. Daniel stepped outside first and walked around the rover, performing a careful inspection of the tires and solar panels mounted across the vehicle's roof. The desert air was calm now, carrying only a faint warmth that hinted at the heat that would arrive later in the afternoon. After checking the rear cargo compartment, he climbed into the driver's seat and powered up the navigation display. Inside the garage, Lyra hesitated before climbing down from the bench and moving closer to the doorway. The open desert beyond looked enormous and unfamiliar, stretching for miles in every direction. Daniel noticed her standing near the entrance and leaned out of the rover window slightly. "You can ride along if you want," he said in the same relaxed tone he used for everything else. Lyra looked at the rover and then back at him. The vehicle was easily 10 times taller than she was, but Daniel reached over and placed a small empty storage box on the passenger seat where she could stand safely. The surface inside the rover was smooth metal, warmed by the sunlight coming through the windshield. Lyra climbed inside carefully and stood near the edge of the box while Daniel closed the door and started the engine. The rover rolled forward slowly across the landing pad before turning toward a narrow maintenance path that led across the desert. As the station faded behind them, Lyra pressed her hands against the window glass, watching the landscape move past in wide, silent waves of red stone and wind-shaped sand. Daniel kept one hand on the steering controls while glancing occasionally at the navigation screen mounted beside the dashboard. The nearest supply tower appeared as a blinking marker nearly 12 miles north of the station. Old mining equipment still depended on those towers for power distribution, even though most of the original crews had left years earlier. Lyra finally looked away from the passing desert and turned toward Daniel. "Why maintain towers if no one lives here anymore?" she asked. Daniel adjusted the rover's speed slightly as the terrain shifted from smooth sand to rougher stone. "Because someone might return one day," he answered calmly. "Infrastructure should be ready when people need it again." Lyra considered that idea while watching the distant tower slowly grow larger on the horizon. Her people often abandoned worlds once resources were exhausted, moving entire operations to new systems without looking back. Yet this human mechanic continued maintaining equipment for a future that might not arrive for years. The rover continued across the open desert under the wide morning sky, while sunlight flashed across its windshield and the quiet hum of the engine filled the cabin. Standing in the passenger seat beside the giant human driver, Lyra realized that traveling through the vast desert no longer felt frightening. For the first time since her crash landing, the enormous, unfamiliar planet almost felt welcoming. The rover rolled steadily across the desert as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, turning the wide red plains into a sea of glowing copper and gold. 12 miles from the mining station, the supply tower rose from the sand like a quiet metal monument left behind by an older era of exploration. Its tall structure stretched nearly 100 feet into the clear sky, thin support cables humming faintly in the warm air as sunlight reflected across its solar panels. Daniel Carter guided the rover to a slow stop beside the tower's maintenance platform and powered down the engine. The sudden silence made the desert feel even larger than before. Lyra stood inside the small storage box on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield with quiet fascination. From this close the tower seemed enormous, its metal surface covered in rows of weathered panels and communication nodes that had clearly survived years of wind and sand. Daniel opened the rover door and stepped down onto the desert ground before walking toward the tower's base, where a small access panel waited beside the ladder frame. Lyra climbed carefully to the edge of the passenger seat so she could watch. Daniel pulled a handheld scanner from his pocket and placed it against the maintenance console. A soft electronic tone sounded as the device read the tower's systems. "Power flow steady," he said calmly while reading the display. "Solar intake at 83% efficiency. That is still better than I expected." Lyra listened closely as he spoke, noticing the same calm patience he showed when repairing the rover the night before. To Daniel, the tower was not an abandoned machine. It was something that simply needed attention. Daniel opened the small maintenance panel and began adjusting a series of control switches and diagnostic cables with careful precision. The work took only a few minutes, but Lyra could see the satisfaction in his expression when the console lights shifted from amber to green. He stepped back and closed the panel before brushing a little dust from his jacket sleeve. "Another system ready if someone ever needs it again," he said quietly. Lyra climbed down onto the rover seat and looked out across the endless desert surrounding the tower. For miles in every direction, there was nothing except wind-shaped sand and distant rock formations glowing under the bright sky. And yet Daniel had traveled all this way simply to make sure an old piece of equipment still worked. When he returned to the rover and started the engine again, Lyra spoke softly from the passenger seat. "On my world, we believed humans were the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy." Daniel glanced toward her briefly as the rover began rolling slowly away from the tower. "That sounds like something a lot of people probably believe," he replied with a small smile. Lyra looked back through the rear window at the tall metal tower standing quietly in the desert sunlight. "Maybe they were wrong," she said after a moment. Daniel kept his eyes on the long road leading back toward the distant mining station while the rover moved steadily across the open plains. Out here on the far edge of space, there were no crowds, no cities, and no witnesses to the small, quiet choices that shaped the future. Just a patient mechanic, a tiny traveler from another world, and a desert full of machines waiting for someone who still believed they were worth fixing. And as the rover carried them back toward the station under the wide American mile sky, Lyra finally understood something her people had never recorded in their ancient archives. Humans were not frightening because of what they could destroy. They were frightening because of how much they were willing to care about things everyone else had already forgotten.